In this video, we're going to talk about how international trade affects markets using demand and supply analysis. Let's consider a case in which there's no trade between the US and Canada for apples. And let's suppose the equilibrium price of apples in the US is below the equilibrium price in Canada, as illustrated in the diagram on the screen. If trade is not allowed between the US and Canada, this price differential could persist indefinitely. It turns out that when we see the same good trading at different prices, though, there's an efficiency loss. A very simple explanation is that in the US, the value of an additional apple is less than the value of that additional apple in Canada. If you transferred one apple from the US to Canada, the gains in Canada would outweigh the losses in the US. And that's why this would be inefficient. And if trade is allowed between the US and Canada, that would open up some potential gains from trade. Because either people in Canada could buy apples from the US at a lower price and resell them in Canada, or US producers could sell some of their apples to Canada at a higher price. And when that type of thing happens, when trade is allowed, what we're going to see is that as more apples become available in Canada, the price would fall. As more apples leave the US and move to Canada, the price in the US is going to rise. And if there's no barriers to trade, what we'd expect to see is a new equilibrium with a price in between the two prices. Specifically, it would be at a price where the excess amount that's produced in the US, the difference between quantity demanded and the quantity supplied at this new free trade price, is just equal to the amount by which the quantity demanded in Canada would exceed the quantity that Canadian apple producers could supply. When we combine these two markets together, the overall equilibrium price would be one at which the total quantity demanded in the US and Canada together would just equal the total quantity supplied. But more would be produced in the US than consumed in the US, and those additional apples are shipped to Canada to satisfy Canadian demand. So that's how the equilibrium would be affected. But let's talk about the welfare effects of this, how this affects consumers and producers. If we look at the effect on consumers, what we observe is that US consumers would be worse off because now they have to pay a higher price. Canadian consumers would be better off because they'd receive a lower price. We can measure this using consumer surplus. Specifically, the diagram on the left illustrates the loss in consumer surplus that would be received by US consumers in response to the higher price of apples. Remember, consumer surplus is the difference between the price that's paid for a good and the marginal value that people place on the good. It's the difference between the amount that someone's willing to pay for the good and the price they actually pay. Now that the price is higher and fewer apples are consumed, the US loses that shaded reddish area on that diagram. In Canada, on the other hand, though, because the price has been reduced, consumer surplus increases by the amount of that blue area. The red trapezoid represents a loss in consumer surplus in the US because consumers now have to pay more, while the blue trapezoid represents a gain received by Canadian consumers. So if we just look at this aspect of it, it appears that Canadians gain, the US loses, and that might be something that US consumers might prefer to see not happening. However, this change affects not only consumers, it also affects producers. And in the same way we measured the change in consumer surplus, we could measure the change in producer surplus. The diagram here now reflects the change in producer surplus that occurs. In the US, because apple producers are now receiving a higher price for the good, the amount of surplus they receive is greater. So apple producers in the US now receive a higher price and sell more apples than they did before. So that blue trapezoid represents the gain in producer surplus. Canadian producers, on the other hand, now that the price is lower and they're producing less, experience a loss in producer surplus. So the blue trapezoid is a gain that US producers receive. The red trapezoid in the diagram on the right represents the loss in producer surplus by Canadian apple growers. To see what the net effect is, let's first focus on the diagram for the US. Focus on the left portion of the screen. We see the gain that producers receive is equal to that blue trapezoid, but going back, we see that consumers lost this amount. If we compare the amount that consumers lose with the gain that producers receive, we observe there's a net gain to producers, which is equal to that yellow triangle on the diagram on the left. Now, let's look at the effect in Canada. In Canada, consumers gain that blue trapezoid, looking at the right portion of this diagram. Producers receive a loss equal to this reddish trapezoid, leading to a net gain of that yellow triangle. So what we observe is that there are gains from trade in both the US and Canada when free trade is allowed between the two countries. This is the basic argument that economists always use in support of free trade. It's not a particularly new one. It goes back actually to the time of Adam Smith. So what we can observe is that trade improves net welfare in both the importing and the exporting country. However, we should note that there are costs to some groups. In the countries where prices go up, consumers are made worse off. In the countries where trade results in lower prices, the producers are made worse off. And when you see opposition to trade, it most often comes from either the firms or the workers in those industries that are adversely affected by lower price foreign competition. And I think if you think about many of the trade disputes you've heard, that has been the major source of most of the opposition to free trade. But as economists always note, even though some people are made worse off, the gains to those who benefit in each country are larger in magnitude than the costs within each country.